Every Friday night, for 25 years, my husband locked himself in the basement for exactly 3 hours. He swore it was government work, too important to be disturbed, not even by the cries of our children. I believed him, until the day I picked up a hammer and broke the door down. But before we begin, I have one request for you. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel, because it helps me so much to keep sharing my stories. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It brings me joy to know how far my voice can travel. I've never been there myself. It was the summer of 1957 in a small Midwestern town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where the courthouse clock still rang every hour and the smell of fresh bread drifted from the corner bakery on Main Street. The days were long and golden, the evenings cooled by the wind that came off the wheat fields, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and rain. Life felt slower there, almost as if time itself had agreed to linger. Families gathered on front porches after dinner, sipping iced tea in tall glasses, talking about crops, church picnics, and the small triumphs and worries of daily life. In that world, I was 18, with my whole life just beginning. I was Margaret Sullivan back then, though at the start of that summer, I still carried my maiden name. My parents ran a little grocery on the edge of the town square, and I had grown up stacking shelves, counting change, and greeting the steady stream of neighbours who came in each morning. We were not wealthy, but we were proud of our honesty, our hard work, and the way the town relied on us. I was a simple girl with simple dreams, a steady home, children, and a husband who would treat me kindly. And then Frank walked into my life. Frank Sullivan was 27, tall and broad-shouldered, always dressed in a pressed suit that seemed too fine for our dusty streets. His dark hair was slicked back, his green eyes sharp and attentive, and he carried himself like a man who knew where he was headed. He had just arrived from Chicago to work at the only bank in town. To the young women of our community, he was something of a sensation. They whispered about him at church socials, noticed the shine on his black leather shoes, the gold watch that caught the afternoon sun. But he never lingered long in their company. Instead, he came often to our store. At first, just once a week, buying a newspaper and a bar of dark chocolate. Later, almost every day, asking me questions with a warm smile, complimenting my hair, telling my father he admired the way we ran our business. My father, who respected anyone good with numbers, was impressed by Frank's easy talk about finances and politics. To me, Frank seemed worldly, confident, and far older than the boys my own age who still stumbled over their words. It was not long before he asked if he could take me to the movie theatre. My father gave his blessing, and that Friday, Frank and I sat side by side in the darkened hall, watching a romantic comedy that made me blush when Frank's hand brushed mine. That night, my heart leapt in a way I had never known. 6 months later, under the glow of Christmas lights, Frank asked my father for my hand. My mother cried with joy, and my father opened a bottle of wine he had saved for years. By May of 1957, I was married in the town's modest white-steepled church, wearing a gown sewn by my mother and grandmother. The reception took place in the parish hall, decorated with wildflowers picked from the fields that morning. I remember the smell of the cake, the old records spinning on the turntable, the way the sunlight slanted through the windows as I whispered to myself, "My life is beginning today." Frank and I moved into an old two-story house on a quiet street. It was larger than we needed, with hardwood floors that creaked at night and a broad porch where I imagined rocking babies to sleep. In the back was a wide yard shaded by a maple tree. and underneath the house, a basement with a heavy wooden door. At first, the house felt like a dream, a place filled with promise and warmth. Frank helped paint the walls, planted roses along the fence, and spoke of filling the rooms with children's laughter. But it was not long before I noticed something unusual. Frank was careful, almost possessive about the basement. He told me that he intended to make it his private office, a place where he could work on confidential financial matters for the bank. "It's not for you to worry about, Margaret," he said gently. "Just a little space for me to focus. I need to handle some things that can't be interrupted." At 18, newly married and eager to be the kind of wife my mother had raised me to be, I didn't argue. A good wife, I thought, trusted her husband. Still, I heard the hammering, the shifting of furniture, the sound of wood being sawed. Frank spent hours down there, and when he came back up, he always locked the door behind him, sliding the brass key into his pocket. He would smile, kiss me on the cheek, and tell me not to worry. Weeks turned into months, and one evening, Frank established a pattern that would rule our household for decades. It was a Friday in early summer. The sun was just beginning to set, painting the sky a soft pink over the rooftops, when Frank finished his supper in haste. He bathed, splashed on his best cologne, and said in a voice steady and firm, "Margaret, I have work from the government tonight. It will take 3 hours, not a minute more, not a minute less. No matter what happens, I cannot be disturbed. Please, stay in our room, and do not come near the basement." He kissed my forehead and closed the basement door with a sound that echoed down the hallway. I sat upstairs, listening. The town was quiet outside, the crickets beginning their evening chorus, the screen door rattling in the breeze. Inside, all I could hear was the occasional creak of the floorboards above the basement. I wondered why the government would send secret files to a bank manager in a town so small. Why always on Fridays? Why always 3 hours exactly? But Frank's voice had carried such certainty, and I was young enough to believe that men knew more about the world than women. So I did as I was told. I stayed away. Week after week, the same ritual unfolded. Friday dinners eaten in silence, the scent of his cologne hanging in the hallway, the heavy lock clicking shut. For 3 hours, the house seemed hollow, as though I were its only occupant. And when Frank returned, he would emerge calm, adjusting his tie, acting as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Neighbours admired him, spoke of his discipline and charm, and my parents beamed with pride at the man I had married. To the outside world, ours was a marriage blessed with stability and promise. But inside, behind that locked door, a mystery grew. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Men needed their space. A bank manager had responsibilities I could never understand. And yet, late at night, when Frank's even breathing signaled that he was asleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling and asked myself silent questions. What was really happening in that basement? And why did it feel as though the man I married had built a wall between us, brick by brick, locked behind a door I was never meant to cross? I told myself not to dwell on it, that love meant trust. But even in those early days, before children, before the decades of repetition, a seed of doubt had been planted deep in my heart. And though I pushed it down, pretending it wasn't there, I knew one day I would have to face what lay behind that locked door. Edward was born in the spring of 1958, a healthy baby boy with a tuft of dark hair and lungs strong enough to wake the entire neighborhood. I remember cradling him in my arms by the window, the lilacs blooming in the yard, thinking that life could not possibly hold greater joy. Frank beamed with pride, telling neighbors that his son would one day be a man of consequence. People congratulated us warmly, and I slipped into my new role with the quiet eagerness of someone who believed she was living the American dream. 4 years later, in 1962, our daughter arrived. We named her Celia. She had soft curls the color of chestnuts and the calmest blue eyes I had ever seen. Edward, by then 4 years old, would stand on his tiptoes to peer into her crib, proud to be her big brother. I watched them together and thought, this is what happiness is meant to be. A home filled with the laughter of children. And then, 13 years later, when I was already in my mid-30s, Benjamin came into our lives. He was a surprise, a late gift, born in 1975. By then, Edward was a grown young man on the edge of adulthood, and Celia was a teenager with books scattered across her desk, dreaming of college. Benjamin's arrival brought chaos and tenderness all at once, his small body wrapped in blankets, his cries filling rooms that had grown too quiet. I felt young again, though lines had started to show on my face and my hands had grown rough with work. By the mid-1970s, Frank had become the respected manager of the local bank. He was seen as a pillar of the community, always immaculately dressed, always with a confident handshake for townsfolk on the courthouse steps. At Rotary luncheons, at church on Sundays, even at the high school football games, people spoke of him as a man to admire. He was the kind of husband small-town wives wished they had, or at least that was the illusion. And me? I became the kind of woman magazines wrote about in those years, though I never saw myself as extraordinary. I baked casseroles for church suppers, folded laundry warm from the dryer with the hum of the radio in the background, and tended the garden where roses bloomed each June. Neighbors stopped by for coffee and recipes, praising how well I managed the house and raised polite, bright children. I was the picture of a Midwestern homemaker in the 1970s, apron tied around my waist, a pie cooling on the windowsill. Yet beneath that picture-perfect life, there was a ritual I could not ignore. Every Friday evening, without fail, Frank disappeared into the basement. It did not matter if Edward had a fever, if Celia cried from a nightmare, or if Benjamin wailed for milk. When the clock struck 7, Frank's plate was cleared, his shirt freshly pressed, his cologne sharp in the air, and he would descend the steps, lock the heavy door, and vanish for 3 hours. Not 2, not 4, always 3. I learned to manage around it. If one of the children sobbed, I soothed them, alone. If the phone rang, I answered with my free hand. Upstairs, the television played sitcoms and news reports, the house settling with its usual creaks, while in the basement, silence pressed like a weight. Even the children, once old enough to notice, understood. On Friday nights, Daddy was not to be disturbed. Edward grew into a tall young man with steady hands, eager to prove himself. By the time he graduated from high school, he was already speaking of engineering schools in the city, chasing dreams bigger than our town could hold. Celia, thoughtful and studious, carried notebooks everywhere, filling them with lesson plans and little poems. She longed to be a teacher, to shape young minds. And Benjamin, bright-eyed and restless, followed me around the kitchen, tugging at my apron strings, hungry for stories and attention. Our neighbors praised us as a model family. At the church's Mothers Club, they once honored me as an example of devotion and grace. I smiled, accepted the plaque, and went home to scrub dishes with soap bubbles clinging to my wrists. Outwardly, I had everything a woman of my generation was supposed to want: children, a fine house, a respected husband. But inside, when the Fridays came and the basement door clicked shut, I felt something hollow. I tried to bury those feelings in routine, folding Benjamin's pajamas, ironing Celia's skirts for Sunday service, packing Edward's lunches. Some nights I would sit on the porch swing alone, the crickets loud in the grass, staring at the basement window where the curtains always stayed drawn. I told myself it didn't matter. Perhaps this was the price of stability, of comfort, of keeping the family together. By 1982, our house had weathered decades of birthdays, Christmas mornings with stockings by the fireplace, and photographs lined neatly on the mantel. Edward had already left for college. Celia was in her sophomore year, writing letters home filled with tales of professors and dorm life. That left Benjamin, 7 years old, with boundless curiosity and a habit of asking questions no one else dared to voice. One bright afternoon, while I was hanging laundry on the line, he came running from the yard, cheeks flushed, hair sticking to his forehead in damp curls. "Mama," he said breathlessly, "I met a lady and 2 kids down the street. They told me I was their brother." I froze, a sheet half pinned to the rope, the summer breeze lifting it like a sail. His words hung in the air, innocent yet heavy, the kind of words that shift the ground beneath your feet. Benjamin was only 7, still all knees and elbows, his shoelaces forever untied, when he brought home a truth that rattled me more than any sound I had ever heard behind that basement door. It was a Tuesday afternoon, sunlight slanting across the linoleum in the kitchen, the smell of chicken stew simmering on the stove. He bounded in, cheeks flushed from the playground, his backpack dangling from one shoulder. "Mama," he began, breathless. "My new teacher, Miss Clarice. She had a picture in her wallet. And Mama, it was Daddy. Daddy with her and 2 kids. She closed it real fast when I asked, but I saw it. It was him." The ladle slipped from my hand and clattered against the pot. Steam rose, curling in the air, carrying with it the scent of onions and thyme. But I could barely breathe. I forced my lips into something resembling a smile, patted his hair, and told him perhaps he was mistaken. He accepted that easily, the way children trust their mother's words. But when he ran back outside, the kitchen felt colder, as though the truth had seeped in through the cracks in the windows. That night, I did not sleep. The ceiling fan hummed above me, circling endlessly, mocking my restless thoughts. I thought of the woman Benjamin had once pointed out at the corner of our street, a woman in a pale blue dress with 2 children at her side. I had brushed it away then, a fleeting moment, a stranger passing by. But now the memory and Benjamin's words fit together like puzzle pieces snapping into place. I did not confront Frank. Men like him were too skilled at smoothing over doubt, too practiced at using their steady voice to make you feel foolish. Instead, I chose silence, and in that silence, I began to watch. At first, it was small things. Frank's jacket, draped neatly over the chair after supper. One evening, while he bathed, I slipped my hand into the inside pocket. My fingers brushed against an envelope, the paper fine, addressed in a delicate, looping hand that did not belong to any bank secretary. I lifted it, pressed it to my nose, and caught the faint scent of lavender. My breath caught in my throat. I did not open it. Cowardice or mercy, I cannot say which, but I slid it back exactly as I had found it, hands trembling as though I had just touched fire. Then there were the finances. Frank had always held the purse strings, doling out enough each month for groceries, for the children's clothes, for small indulgences like a new mixer or a Sunday roast. I had never questioned it. But now, Every figure seemed suspect. A bill for a restaurant I had never set foot in. A withdrawal larger than what we needed. Receipts folded into his wallet with dates that did not match the stories he told. I did not yet have proof of betrayal, but the arithmetic of his life no longer added up. And then came the book. It was a rainy Thursday, thunder muttering over the flat Midwestern fields, when I found it in his upstairs desk. Tucked between ledgers and contracts lay a children's book with bright illustrations of castles and fairy tale forests. On the first page, written in his familiar hand, were the words, "To Helena, with love from Dad." Helena. The name had no place in our family tree. No niece or goddaughter, no neighbour's child. My vision blurred with tears as I clutched the book, the inscription like a knife across the life I thought I had built. This was no client's child. This was his. The seasons passed, but I was no longer the woman I had once been. The summer brought block parties and baseball games. Autumn, with its fiery maples, carried homecoming parades down Main Street. I stood among the neighbours, clapping politely, my face composed, while inside I replayed Benjamin's words and that inscription. In the pews on Sunday morning, as the preacher spoke of faith and fidelity, I stared at Frank's profile and wondered how many lies could live behind one man's still face. Even in small things, I began to notice differences. The way he lowered his voice when the phone rang, slipping into the den and closing the door. The way he lingered by the mirror on Fridays, adjusting his tie just so, a touch of cologne stronger than usual. I realized that the scent clung to his shirts differently, mingled sometimes with a perfume that was not mine. Neighbours still called us the picture-perfect family. They saw Edward, now grown and away at college, full of promise. They saw Celia, studious and graceful, dreaming of teaching children. They saw little Benjamin racing through the yard, laughter trailing behind him. They saw me, with my pies cooling on the windowsill and roses blooming in the yard. What they did not see were the shadows. The shadows were mine alone. And then came the night of the key. Frank had said he was stepping out for cigarettes before his usual Friday routine. His jacket lay across the back of the chair in the bedroom. I stood there for a long moment, the lamp casting a weak pool of light across the fabric. My hand moved almost without my consent, slipping into the inside pocket. This time I did not find a letter, not a receipt, but a key. It was smaller than the one that locked the basement, brass catching the lamplight. On its ring was a charm, a 4-leaf clover, gleaming like some private joke. I turned it over in my palm, its weight cold, unfamiliar. A key to what? To where? I held it for a long while, feeling the sharp edges dig into my skin. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me more than any winter wind, that this key was not meant for any door in the home we shared. It belonged to another life, a life I had never been invited into. And for the first time, I understood. The cracks in the glass were not cracks at all. The whole window of my marriage had been shattered. I was only just beginning to see through it. Friday evenings had become a ritual of silence in our house. The grandfather clock in the hallway would toll 7, and Frank would disappear behind the locked basement door with a calm certainty that no one dared question. But that night, my patience, my 25 years of obedience, dried up like the last leaf clinging to a November tree. The house was still. The children were gone, grown or tucked away, and Benjamin, our youngest, was asleep upstairs, his breath soft and steady. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring at the empty chair where Frank had eaten dinner quickly, barely tasting the pot roast I had spent the day preparing. He had kissed my cheek, pressed a handkerchief into his pocket, and slipped into the basement as always. But this time, I followed the sound of the lock turning, followed the echo of his steps fading below. My own heart was beating hard enough that I thought it might betray me, like a drum too loud in a quiet church. I stood in front of that door, the paint chipped from years of use, the brass knob reflecting the trembling light of the hallway lamp, and I raised the hammer. It was the same hammer Frank had used countless times for fixing loose shutters or repairing fence posts, its wooden handle smoothed by his hands. Now it was mine, clutched tight, every ounce of betrayal sharpening my strength. The first strike was deafening, a crack that seemed to split not just the lock, but the years of silence I had carried inside. The second blow broke it clean. The door creaked open. I half expected darkness, damp stone walls, perhaps shelves of government files as Frank had always claimed. But the light flickered on easily, casting a glow not of secrecy, but of luxury. I stood on the threshold, breath frozen, staring at a room that belonged to another world. It was not a basement at all. It was an office, polished and expensive, far grander than anything we had ever allowed ourselves upstairs. A mahogany desk gleamed at the center, its surface free of dust, orderly, as if someone cared more deeply for this hidden space than for the home above. A leather armchair rested near a brass lamp, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with carefully labeled binders. The faint scent of cologne mixed with a trace of perfume, the kind of sweetness that clings to someone else's skin. And then my eyes found the wall. A map of our town, our own Midwestern town, the streets and intersections I knew by heart, was pinned with coloured tacks, each marking places I did not understand. Below it, framed in gold, was a photograph that punched the breath out of me. Frank, in his suit, smiling that same easy smile he wore to church picnics, stood with a woman I recognized from Benjamin's stories. Clarice, her hair chestnut, her dress a soft blue, her arm looped around him, and two children at their side, a boy with Frank's jawline, a girl with his green eyes. The frame said it all, without words. Our family. Christmas, 1977. I staggered closer, fingers brushing the cold glass. My knees nearly buckled. All the years of whispers, the missing dollars, the unexplained trips, the Friday nights. They had not been paranoia. They had been my life. On the desk lay a stack of letters, bound neatly with twine, arranged as carefully as love letters often are. My hands shook as I untied them. The first was dated 1960, ink slightly faded, written in a delicate feminine script. My dearest Frank, I know you have obligations at home, but what we share is too strong to deny. I read only fragments, my eyes blurring with tears. Another letter, this one from 1967. I'm carrying your child. I won't ask you to leave her, but please, let him know his father. And then photographs. August as a baby, Helena in pigtails clutching a teddy bear. Years of birthdays, school plays, holidays where Frank had smiled with them as he had smiled with us. Mixed among the tender words were documents far colder. Bank statements, slips of numbers carefully adjusted, withdrawals and deposits that told of money moved like pieces on a chessboard. He hadn't just betrayed me with love. He had betrayed the bank, the very place that had trusted him as its pillar. I sank into the leather chair, the hammer still in my lap, the letters spilling across my knees. For a long moment, I could not move. The truth was too vast, too heavy. I was not only a wife abandoned, I had been a silent accomplice, carrying the facade while he lived two lives. The basement walls closed in. The lamp's glow seemed to harden the edges of every lie, every photograph, every receipt. The air felt heavy with decades of deception. Yet strangely, beneath the storm of rage and heartbreak, a new calm settled in me. I gathered the papers, the letters, the photographs, and placed them carefully into a folder. Not because I wanted to keep them, but because I knew they were weapons, proof stronger than my tears. When at last the clock upstairs struck 10, I realized Frank would be returning soon. My hands no longer trembled, my heart still bled, but my face was steady. I arranged the folder neatly, laid it on my lap, and sat waiting in the chair. The basement was no longer his sanctuary. It was my stage. And for the first time in 25 years, Frank Sullivan would walk into a room where I held the truth, and he would not be the one in control. The basement was no longer a mystery when Frank returned that night. I was waiting for him, not as the obedient wife who had spent decades guarding his secrets, but as a woman who finally held the truth in her hands. The clock had just struck 10 when the back door clicked open. His footsteps, once familiar, now sounded like an intruder's trespass. Frank stepped into the basement, expecting solitude, perhaps even comfort, only to find me seated in his leather chair, a folder thick with letters and photographs resting on my lap. His face drained of colour. For the first time in our marriage, I saw fear in his eyes. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice trembling just enough to betray him. 25 years, Frank," I said softly, though my tone carried the weight of a hammer's blow. 25 years of lies, of Friday nights locked away while I raised our children and believed every word you told me. He tried to speak, but I raised a hand. "Don't. I've read everything. I know about Clarice, about August, about Helena, about the money from the bank." His jaw clenched, the lines of age deepening across his face. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he muttered. "You weren't supposed to find out?" I cut him short, rising from the chair. "You built your life on secrets, Frank. But tonight, the locks broke." He reached toward me as if to plead, but I stepped back. The folder was clutched against my chest like armor. "You will leave this house," I said. My voice, calm and steady, surprised even me. "Tonight. You will take what you need, and you will not return." Shock flickered across his face. "Margaret, this is our home. Our children." "Our children deserve the truth," I said firmly. "And they will not grow up under the shadow of your lies." Silence pressed down on us like the weight of the old house itself. At last, Frank nodded, though his eyes darted toward the desk as if longing for the life he had built here, the double existence I had shattered. He climbed the stairs without another word, and I listened to the sound of drawers opening, suitcases pulled from closets. 30 minutes later, the front door closed behind him. I stood alone in the basement, every nerve trembling, and yet I felt lighter than I had in years. The divorce came swiftly. The evidence I had gathered left little room for argument. Frank surrendered his rights to the house, though not without bitterness. The court granted me custody of Benjamin, our youngest, while Edward and Celia were already forging their own paths into adulthood. The town, of course, did not stay quiet. In a community where news travelled faster than the river's current, everyone seemed to know. At church, heads turned. At the grocery store, whispers filled the aisles. I was the woman left behind, the one he betrayed. But I learned to keep my chin high, to walk with dignity even when pity or judgment followed me. Benjamin, still a boy, clung to me in those months of upheaval. His small hands would grip my apron as though I might vanish as his father had. I promised him, again and again, that I would never leave. But promises do not fill a child's heart with warmth, nor do they put food on the table. I needed more than words. I needed work, something that would keep us standing. And so I returned to what my grandmother had taught me long ago, in a kitchen fragrant with cinnamon and sugar, baking. At first, it was just apple pies cooling on the windowsill, sold to neighbours who offered polite smiles. Then came pecan pies at Thanksgiving, brownies for school fundraisers, bundt cakes wrapped in wax paper. Word spread faster than I could have imagined. The very basement that had housed Frank's secrets now smelled of butter and vanilla, ovens glowing where deceit had once lived. I called it Margaret's Sweets. It was no grand shop, not at first. Just folding tables set up in the basement, hand-painted signs, and my own hands kneading dough before dawn. But soon enough, customers came knocking. The banker's wife, who once avoided my eyes, now placed orders for birthday cakes. The sheriff's sister drove 3 miles for my lemon bars. Even women from church, who had once whispered about my shame, began to bring their daughters to me for baking lessons. Each pie I pulled from the oven felt like more than dessert. It was proof that I could build something new, something honest, with my own hands. Where Frank had poured deceit, I poured sugar and hope. Where he had built lies, I built bread, cookies, and cake. The business grew. With the money I earned, I bought a second oven, then hired a neighbour's daughter to help with deliveries. Benjamin, now old enough to reach the counter, became my assistant, sprinkling chocolate chips with the solemnity of a priest blessing communion. I would watch him laugh, flour dusting his hair, and think, this is the family I choose to keep. Still, there were nights when the house fell quiet, when memories of Frank pressed in like shadows. The sound of a car passing by could make my heart stutter, fearing it was him returning. But he never did, not in any way that mattered. Years passed, and the pain softened into something else. A scar, perhaps, but no longer an open wound. Margaret's Sweets became a fixture in our town, its basement origins whispered now with admiration rather than pity. People said I had turned tragedy into triumph, though I never saw it that way. I only did what I had to do. It was during one such afternoon, nearly a decade after Frank had left, that the phone rang. I was in the shop, icing a tray of brownies, the radio humming an old country tune. Mrs. Sullivan? The voice on the line was young, uncertain, yet unmistakably polite. Yes, this is Margaret, I replied, wiping my hands on a cloth. My name is Helena, she said, and my knees nearly gave out. I'm Frank's daughter. With Clarice. She paused, her breath catching. I know this is sudden, but my brother, August, he's been in an accident. He wants to see you, and he wants to meet his brothers and sister. The brownies before me blurred. For a moment I could not speak. All the years, all the pain, all the truths I had locked away came flooding back through that single name, Helena. And there, in my quiet little shop, the life I had rebuilt trembled with the weight of a past that refused to stay buried. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm linen, the steady hum of machines filling the silence that words could not bridge. I stepped inside with Edward, Celia, and little Benjamin at my side. For years, I had wondered if this moment might come. An encounter not with Frank, but with the lives he left in his wake. On the bed lay August, A young man of 20, with dark hair cropped close and eyes that carried the weight of someone who had grown up asking questions with no easy answers. A cast covered his left leg, raised on a sling, but his expression was not one of pain. It was a mixture of hope and wariness, like someone waiting to see if the world might offer kindness for once. At his side stood Helena, tall and graceful at 17, her light brown hair falling loosely around her shoulders. She clutched her purse with both hands, as though holding on to the last piece of certainty she had. Her voice trembled when she greeted us. "You came?" she whispered. I nodded. We did. For a long moment, no one moved. My children lingered near me, their bodies tense, their eyes darting between the strangers who shared their father's blood. And yet, beneath the tension, I felt something else stirring, an invisible thread pulling them toward one another. August broke the silence first. I wanted to meet you," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion that thickened it. "All these years, I wondered what you were like. I used to imagine brothers and sisters somewhere out there. And now, here you are." Benjamin, curious in the way only children can be, stepped closer before either Edward or Celia could hold him back. "You really are my brother?" he asked plainly, his voice soft but clear. August gave a small smile, nodding. "Yes, I am." Helena's eyes welled up as she watched them. "And I'm your sister," she added gently. Something in Benjamin's face relaxed. He reached out, resting his small hand against August's cast. For a boy who had lost so much, the idea of gaining even a fragment of family seemed to mend something inside him. Edward remained reserved, his arms crossed, the anger of old wounds flickering across his features. Celia's eyes shimmered with tears she did not let fall, caught between suspicion and compassion. But slowly, almost reluctantly, they moved closer, each step pulling them into a circle of shared truth that none of us had chosen, yet all of us had inherited. We sat together in that room for hours. At first, the words were clumsy, scattered, heavy with caution. But as the evening stretched on, stories began to flow. August spoke of birthdays where Frank had promised to come but never arrived, of questions about why their father always seemed half absent, always looking over his shoulder. Helena shared how their mother, Clarice, had tried to shield them from disappointment, but the gaps were too wide to fill. And in return, Edward and Celia spoke, hesitant at first, about Friday nights when Frank vanished into the basement, about the confusion of a father who smiled at neighbours yet left shadows at home. We discovered that while our lives had been different, the ache was the same. By the time we left that hospital room, something had shifted. Not reconciliation, not yet, but recognition. We were no longer strangers bound only by betrayal. We were siblings, however fractured, who understood each other's wounds in ways no one else ever could. The years that followed were a slow weaving together of broken threads. Letters exchanged between Celia and Helena, long phone calls between Edward and August, holiday visits where Benjamin beamed with the delight of an ever-expanding family. It was not simple. At times, old resentments resurfaced. But there was also laughter, unexpected, healing laughter that carried across kitchen tables and birthday parties. Piece by piece, we built something that Frank himself had never managed, a family grounded not in deception, but in honesty. Frank, meanwhile, drifted further away from all of us. His choices had cost him both families, and he never found footing again. Word reached us through whispers, through the occasional letter that grew shorter as the years went on. Failed businesses, fleeting relationships, excuses wrapped in half-truths. When the phone rang one morning with the news of his death at 65, alone in a small apartment, discovered only after days of silence, I felt no triumph, no relief. Only a solemn understanding that the man who had once filled my life with promises had ended it with emptiness. We attended his funeral, all of us, my children, August, Helena, even Clarice, who stood apart but not hostile. It was a modest service, attended by few, the air heavy not with grief, but with resignation. As I watched the casket lowered, I realized that Frank had never belonged fully to any of us. He had chosen to live divided, and in the end, division was all that remained of him. But our story did not end there. Back in my own home, I transformed the basement once again. The same space where secrets had lived for decades became the thriving heart of Margaret's sweets. Where there had once been maps marking his hidden life, now shelves overflowed with flour, sugar, and jars of pecans. Where there had been photographs of a false family, now hung drawings from my grandchildren, crayon-coloured sons and stick figures with smiling faces. I often worked late into the night, rolling dough or frosting cakes, pausing sometimes to let my hand rest against the cool countertop. It was no longer a place of shadows, but of light. Customers came not just for pies and brownies, but for the comfort of a space born out of survival and turned into joy. And as my children grew, as Benjamin found his own footing, as Edward and Celia carved lives they could be proud of, as even August and Helena became part of our gatherings, I understood something I had never dared believe. Freedom begins where truth is allowed to breathe. I could not rewrite the years Frank had stolen, nor could I erase the pain. But I could choose what to carry forward. I chose honesty, dignity, and the sweetness of work done with my own hands. And that choice, that lesson, became the legacy I wanted to leave to my children, to my grandchildren, to anyone who might hear my story and wonder if it is possible to survive the shattering of illusions. Yes, it is, because the end of deceit is not the end of life. It is the beginning. When we reach the end of a story like this, we are left not with noise, but with silence, the kind that settles deep inside the heart. It reminds us that truth, no matter how painful, has the power to set us free. It reminds us that even when trust is broken, even when love takes unexpected turns, we still carry within us the strength to rise, to rebuild, and to love again in our own way. Perhaps, as you listen, you find yourself thinking of doors you never dared to open, of questions you once set aside. Life teaches us that facing what is hidden is never easy, but it is often the first step toward peace. So I wish you, wherever you are tonight, the quiet courage to honor your own truth and the grace to keep walking forward. Thank you for sharing this time with me. If this story touched you, I'd be grateful if you liked this video and subscribed, so we can continue to walk through these stories together.